anything strange about this early 18th century fort? In particular, do you notice anything weird about the positioning of the guns? Well, here's a hint for you. The sea is that away. The village is that away, which simply means that while the enemy are busy attacking from the front, these poor misguided souls are busy shooting themselves in the foot. Hi everybody, I'm Angelo. Welcome to this week's Outdoor Journal and welcome to Grenada. Believe it or not, the positioning of these guns played a major role in the historically rich background of this country. But to really get the idea and the true story, we got to start at the top. And in Grenada, starting at the top is quite easy. This is the hilliest part of the island. It's the crater of an extinct volcano, and it makes a perfect natural harbor. This, of course, has made it the center of many a battle. It's simple. Whoever controls this port controls the island. There may be lots of natural riches in the forest, but if you can't get them back to your home country, you may as well just sit in the sun. And like so many of these islands in the Caribbean, they flip-flop from country to country. In fact, it's difficult to say who really has birthrights on this island. As far back as 3,000 years, the Caribbeans took the islands away from the original inhabitants from South America. But it was the Europeans who brought modern warfare, with their big cannons and gunpowder. Welcome to Fort George. Behind me is state-of-the-art 18th century armament. 6 long guns, all pointing straight out into the harbor mouth, ready to take on any attacker that would dare come into a fort like this. The perfect defense system, or so the French thought. That was before a French Catholic priest called Father Labat came to visit the fort back in the year was 1700. And he assessed the situation and quickly came up with a pretty negative report. You see, Father Labat thought this type of defense wasn't going to work if the enemy attacked from behind. So, who would attack from the forest? Well, the British would rather sit in the comforts of their gunships and lob mortar shells into the fort. Remember those Caribbeans? Well, while the Europeans were fighting over the island, the Caribs, a rather warlike group, were still in the jungle. So what's a Catholic priest have to do with military defense anyways? Well, 2 things. First of all, Father Labat was a very well-respected man in the area. He had traveled throughout the Caribbean and been to most of the forts throughout the islands and was pretty familiar with what worked and didn't work. And secondly, he was a bit of a historian. You see, he knew that both the British and the Spaniards had been here before, trying to colonize these islands, and both had left saying that the natives were much too aggressive and not worth colonizing. So in his opinion, the next threat was not going to come from sea, but in fact it was going to come from within, from the natives, who incidentally the French had swindled out of this island in the first place. In the late 16th century, the French, instead of trying to conquer the island, had come in and literally stolen it out from under their noses. They had offered the local chief at the time a couple of machetes, a couple of knives, a basket full of glass beads, and of course the ever popular trade bait, some booze, and the chief went for it. So Father Labat knew that eventually there would be reprisal, and in fact, a couple of years after he had said that the battery should be assembled at the rear of the fort, the attack did happen. And fortunately for the French of the time, the cannons were right where they should be, pointing at land. The ancient Carib weapons were, of course, no match for the French guns and shells. Plus, the fort was on the ever-important high ground. Well, within no time, the French had put down the uprising. In fact, they went on to totally exterminate the Carib Indian race. As for Father Labat, he became a bit of a celebrity in these parts. It seems like he was a military genius. Until, of course, the inevitable. The Brits came back, only this time they came back with an ocean full of boats, and you may have guessed it, the French had no guns facing that way. Within 36 hours, the British Empire had an unconditional, uncontested, total surrender of Fort George. Military genius, I'm sure. Finally, in the mid-1970s, Grenada gained its independence from Britain and became one of the smallest countries in the Caribbean. Now it's a world-class tourist destination. 40% of this island's money comes from tourism. And why not? It's got it all jammed into such a small area. Lots of places to shop in town for things like handmade batik and woodcrafts. The ancient volcano that erupted millions of years ago has left behind lakes, lagoons, and beautiful beaches. Lots of cruise ships stop here. In fact, Stick around. Later on in the show, I got a story about a cruise ship you just won't believe. But Grenada's past goes way back, thousands and thousands of years ago. Definitely off the beaten path. I'm about 2 miles outside of the most northerly town here on the island. It's called Sauteur. And remember that name because there is some significance here. I'll talk to you about that a little bit later on. But what I'm doing, I'm going up this little creek valley because a little farther up, in fact I can see it from here, is something that's simply called the Rock. Now, if this place was in any other part of the world, there would be walkways and spotlights and probably a little kiosk with brochures telling you the history of this thing. But out here, it's still virtually untouched. The downside to that is that it's not a trip for just anybody. It's pretty tough getting in here. Pretty steep sides, as a matter of fact, vertical drops, and a lot of marsh and wetlands. But well worth the trip in. So I just got to basically go across this one more piece of water. Hopefully I'll stay dry. If not, it's only about 110 degrees Fahrenheit, as if a little water's going to hurt me. Whew. Ugh. These boulders are huge. Like I said before, wow, there it is there. If this rock was sitting anyplace else, anywhere in the world, you would have people lined up around here on catwalks and walkways and, like I said, little kiosks with brochures. I mean, look at it. This is history right here. And these carvings were made in the early to mid-1700s by the Caribbean Indians, who were the original inhabitants of all these islands. What it basically is a Caribbean billboard, an ancient Caribbean billboard. Each one of these drawings signifies an event. If somebody achieved an accomplishment, whatever that might be, in war or in a village ceremony, whatever the case is. And the form of recognition and gratitude from the villagers was to take his image or her image and put it in a rock so that it would last forever. And you can see the rock is literally covered with images, different sizes, different shapes, some smiling, some not smiling, but they all represent individuals that achieved a certain milestone within their own community. So that's why I call it the billboard. Now, I said that I was a couple of miles outside of the town of Sauteur, and said that was significant. The reason being, Sauteur in French means to leap. The community has the unfortunate historical record as being the last place on earth to see the Caribbean Indian. There were 40 of them left in the year of 1651, and the French had successfully invaded and captured most of the island and forced, through the years, forced the Indians up to this northern portion of the island, and they were just about ready to take over what was left of the tribe, and there were 40 of them left apparently, and they simply jumped off a cliff, which is about 2 miles down the road, right in the town of Sauteur, and ended it all right there. Rather than being captured by the French that were invading their land, they decided to end it, and that was the end of that race, the Caribbean island. So can you imagine that? Being forced to take your own life, knowing full well that you may be the last link to your civilization. Incredible. Coming up, I find out where all that nutmeg for my holiday eggnog comes from. Welcome back to the picture-perfect island of Grenada. From the fort, I can see down into the town of St. George. This is the biggest city on the island, and the majority of the country's hotels, restaurants, and shops are here. Not a huge city. Well, heck, the population of Grenada is only 100,000. Hey, look what I found. The open market. Now this is a bargain hunter's paradise. Spices, spices, and more spices. This woman is trying to sell me a combination basket of sage, cinnamon, tarragon, and the ever-present nutmeg. Like I know what to do with all these spices. The only two spices I ever use are salt and pepper. One would think with all those trees in the forest, more of the buildings would be made of wood, especially the old ones. But everywhere I look are these well-worn bricks. But a lot of these bricks were not made locally. This stuff was imported all the way from Europe. The ships of the time couldn't travel empty, they'd be too light. But the Europeans didn't have much to offer the locals in trade. So to weigh down the ships on the way over to pick up spices, the Europeans carried bricks as ballast, which were left behind to make the buildings. There is no doubt about it. That smell can only mean one thing. We're at the nutmeg capital of the world. Believe it or not, the #1 produce here on the island is not, as you would think, a tropical fruit. It's actually nutmeg. And I'm at the guava processing station, one of the largest, well, in fact, the central processing and distribution center here on the island for the incredible nutmeg spice. Now, you've used it, seen it, I'm sure, in some foods. Probably the most common place where nutmeg is used would be on the Christmas eggnog. At least that's the only place I use it. But then again, I'm not exactly a culinary wizard either. This is Thomas, and what he has in the jar are nutmeg nuts. Now, it's the red stuff in the middle that's the good part. Oddly enough, it was the misfortunes of the Indonesians in the Far East that led to Grenada becoming the Isle of Spice. Nutmegs were brought to Grenada by traders from the East. But when a disease almost wiped out the plantations in Indonesia, Grenada became a world leader in nutmeg production. And you're telling me that the second largest production of nutmeg in the world is done by hand?
Done by hand.
Wow.
And it's in Grenada.
In Grenada. Let's not forget that. The whole process starts when the nuts come down the chute. They are deshelled and the bright red seed is exposed. Okay, now the big question. The big question. How many pounds a year, how much of this product is actually grown and exported here on the island?
Okay, now we have,
I got him there.
We have produced 5 million pounds of nutmeg.
5
million pounds of nutmeg have been brought in from the farmers.
The nuts are then placed in water. This is a sort of grading thing. Trial by water. The ones that sink are the better nuts. The chosen ones are then put on the rack to dry. I can't get over the smell in this place. Every time I breathe, it's like being in a spice factory. Who'd have thunk it? Nutmeg. Then they're checked once again. Now, here's a smart idea. To sort the nuts according to size, they're just run over this plate drilled with holes in it. They're then weighed and packed and sent all over the world. Now that I know so much about the nutmeg, I'm going to keep an eye on everything I eat and see if there's nutmeg in it. How's that? Aside from my drink.
That would be great.
Okay. Thomas, this is fabulous. I appreciate your time.
Okay.
And keep up the good work. What can I tell you?
Thank you very much.
Thanks, buddy.
Okay.
Take care.
It's a pleasure.
Okay, just a minute. Somebody in here smells like a giant Christmas eggnog. Okay, so we got the scoop on that whole nutmeg business. This next thing is quite common here in the Caribbean, and it's the final ingredient to that perfect eggnog, the demon rum. And my friend here tells me he's taken to his favorite distillery. Off we go, Frank, to the rum factory. It's no big secret that rum comes from fermented sugar. Grenada used to be a great producer of sugarcane. But to grow sugarcane, you needed plantations. And to run plantations cheaply, you needed slaves. Well, when slavery was abolished, so went the plantations and, for the most part, the sugar. But there's still a few places where the sugar grows. And where there's sugar in the Caribbean, there's rum. It's kind of ironic that it was the demon liquor of the Europeans that in some ways led to Grenada's early problems. Now, hundreds of years later, part of the economy of Grenada is supported by selling rum back to the Europeans and the rest of the world. Now, you might be wondering what the river has to do with the production of rum. First off, it's not for the rum. It's for powering the presses that squeeze the sugar juices out of the cane. And exactly how sweet is it?
Now you can tell me what it's like.
I just got a sugar rush. Wow. Yeah, excuse me while I have another bite. Now here's where all that sugar juice goes. It gets boiled down and concentrated. Then it's sent off to storage tanks for a couple of days. Are those bats I'm saying, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah? You say that so casually. We're talking hundreds of bats.
Yeah.
Is this why they say drunker than a bat, or is that drunker than a skunk? Drunker than a bat, I think. Show me the rest. Enough of that stuff. And now comes the magic transformation from sugar to rum. For 8 days, the sweet, watery mess is fermented. The rum is then distilled in big kettles, and what comes out sure doesn't taste like what went in. We're talking 150 proof here, folks. They could fuel jets with this stuff. And they don't stand on ceremony here, folks. It's rum right out of the jug. Woo! That is wicked. That's strong. I mean, it's good rum, don't get me wrong,
but it's strong.
You couldn't drink very much of that, could a person?
No.
Okay, I'm ready now for, I don't know what I'm ready for, but after that, I'm ready for just about anything. Listen, thanks a lot. It's been a real pleasure. Appreciate it. Great facility, and keep up the good work.
Okay, I know.
All right. I'm going to stumble my way back to the car. See you later. The island of Grenada is located in the Caribbean, just 90 miles north of the coast of Venezuela. It's not a big island, only 133 square miles, but lots packed into it. As for climate, it's as beautiful as the island itself. Kissed by the trade winds, the average temperature here is around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. That's summer or winter. Coming up, a tale of titanic proportions without the iceberg. And now, back to the Outdoor Journal. Welcome back to the Caribbean island of Grenada. If there's one thing I just can't resist whenever I go anywhere close to water, it's diving. And Grenada is a diver's dream. The crew of Scuba Express took me out and even gave me a great sightseeing tour along the way. Talk about the best view on the island. Today I'm diving the Bianca Sea, a huge cruise liner that sank here in the 1960s. The remarkable thing about the disaster was the enormous amount of participation by the locals in aiding in the rescue. This monument that's erected here right in the harbor was a sign of thanks from the people who owned the Bianca Sea, the Costa ship lines. They were so overwhelmed with the generosity and hospitality that the people here at St. George's showed them when the ship went down that they had to do something. And what they did, they donated this lovely statue, and it said that the identical statue is somewhere in the ocean off of Naples, back in Italy, where the company's head office is. Always go with an experienced dive shop or tour operator. Diving the Bianca Sea is a perfect example. First off, there's no markers and no buoys to say where it is. And even if you did find it on sonar, it's in 160 feet of water with a swift current. By the time you got to the bottom, who knows where you'd be? And you don't want to miss this one. Some great history here. Get this, this was not the first time this ship sank. The Bianca Sea was the largest passenger liner of her day to serve on the Mediterranean-Caribbean route. But her troubles as a ship started long before the tragedy in Grenada. Construction of the Bianca Sea actually started back in 1939, but she was sunk by retreating Germans during World War II. Remarkably, 2 years later, she was raised from the ocean floor and completely rebuilt, and relaunched in June of 1949, 10 years after her original construction. And boy, was she a big one. As far as wrecks go, the Bianca Sea is the second largest in this part of the world. The famed Titanic is, of course, the first. The Bianca Sea was over 600 feet long and weighed in at an incredible 18,000 tons. And now the tale of its second sinking. It was October 22, 1961. The Bianca Sea was anchored in the outer harbor. An explosion rocked the engine room. Some say there were explosives stashed in the engines. Some say it was the engines themselves. A fire broke out and started to race throughout the ship. The alarm was sounded and anything else that could float came to the rescue. There were about 700 people on board, but the response was so quick, only 3 crew members were killed by the initial explosion. After the passengers and crew were removed, the boat was to be towed to a shallow reef for salvage. But the chain broke, and the ship sank to the bottom in 160 feet. This was her final resting place. Oddly enough, the ship still gets hundreds of visitors a year, but no longer is it a white shirt and black tie affair. No, fins and wetsuits are required attire here, and seafood is not served in the dining room anymore. The sea creatures have taken over the dining room. This is not only one of the best wreck dives in the Caribbean, but in the entire world.